The photograph exists, somewhere in a private collection in Moscow, according to at least 2 people who claim to have seen it. There is a photograph taken on the evening of March 14, 1968, inside the main hall of the Dynamo Sports Complex in Hong Kong. In the photograph, a man is standing at a microphone. He is 6 feet 1 inch tall. He weighs 212 pounds. His name is Aleksei Volkov, and he is the reigning Soviet full-contact fighting champion. 3 consecutive titles, a record that had stood for 4 years without serious challenge. In the photograph, he is smiling. What the photograph does not show is what happened 40 minutes later. Volkov had come to Hong Kong as part of a cultural exchange program that the Soviet Athletic Committee had been quietly running since 1966, sending elite competitors to Southeast Asia under the banner of sporting diplomacy. The actual goal was simpler. The Soviets wanted to know what the Asian martial arts traditions were worth, whether the techniques being practiced in the dojos and training halls of Hong Kong and Tokyo and Bangkok had any real application against a trained Western fighter with genuine combat credentials. Volkov was the answer to that question. He was not just a champion, he was a test. He arrived on March 11th with a translator named Dmitry Lashkov, a junior attaché from the Soviet consulate, and a sports journalist named Pyotr Sedov, who was filing dispatches back to a Moscow athletics publication. Sedov would later write about what happened on the 14th. His account is where most of what we know about that evening comes from. It is also, as I'll explain, not entirely reliable. But Sedov was there. That much is not disputed. The event on March 14th was billed as a demonstration, not a competition. The Hong Kong martial arts community had organized a showcase at the Dynamo Hall, which had been rented specifically for the occasion, with the Soviets as guests of honor. Approximately 400 people attended, practitioners from 7 different schools, students, instructors, a handful of journalists, a cluster of American servicemen on leave from bases in Japan who had heard something interesting was happening and shown up without formal invitation. The demonstrations ran for nearly 2 hours. Wing Chun, Hung Gar, Northern Shaolin forms, a weapons display from a school in Kowloon whose head instructor had been training for 31 years. The crowd was respectful, engaged. Volkov watched from the front row. Sedov, in his dispatch, wrote that the Soviet champion was polite throughout, attentive. He asked occasional questions through his translator. He applauded after each demonstration. Then, during the intermission, he was invited to say a few words to the crowd. What he said, through Lashkov, was this: that he had great respect for the traditions on display, that the forms were beautiful, that the history was rich, and that, in his professional opinion as a combat athlete with 18 years of training, Eastern fighting systems produced technically skilled practitioners who had, and he wanted to be precise here, no real power. The hall went quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of offense taken, the quiet of people recalibrating what they had just heard. In Western combat sport, Volkov continued, we build power from the ground through the body, years of specific conditioning. What I have seen tonight is skill. It is art, but art does not knock a man down. He sat back down. Sedov wrote that Volkov seemed genuinely unaware he had said anything provocative, that his tone was academic, almost kind. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then someone in the back of the hall stood up and said in English, I'd like to respond to that. Bruce Lee was 27 years old. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 135 pounds. He had driven to the Dynamo Hall that evening in a car he'd borrowed from a friend because his own was in for repairs. He had not been scheduled to demonstrate. He was there as an observer. He knew several of the instructors performing that night, and the event had been pitched to him as a chance to see what the Soviets made of the arts he had grown up inside. He had been sitting in the 4th row, wearing a dark jacket over a white shirt, when Volkov spoke. The person sitting next to him that evening was a man named Thomas Koo, a junior instructor from a school in Simsha-Tsui, who had trained briefly with Lee 2 years earlier. Koo is still alive. He gave an interview in 1997 to a martial arts publication in Taiwan. He remembers the moment with specific clarity. Bruce didn't react when the Russian spoke, Ku said. No expression. Nothing. I watched his face. He was just still. And then he stood up, and I thought, here we go. What Ku remembers next is the walk. Lee moved from his seat to the front of the hall at a pace that Ku describes as not hurrying, not hesitating, like a man crossing a room to answer a phone he had been expecting. He introduced himself to Volkov through Lashkov without apparent tension. He said he had heard what the champion described. He said he thought there might be a misunderstanding about what power meant in the systems being discussed. And he asked, with what Ku describes as complete politeness, whether Volkov would be willing to feel what he was talking about. Volkov looked at him for a moment. 5'7", 135 pounds. He thought it was a joke, Sedov would write later. I thought it was a joke. Volkov agreed. Here is where the accounts begin to diverge, and I want to be careful about what I tell you. Sedov's dispatch, filed 2 days later, describes what follows with a specificity that suggests genuine memory. Q's 1997 interview offers a different sequence of events for the middle section, not dramatically different, but different in ways that matter. A third account, from one of the American servicemen who was present, surfaced in a 1983 letter printed in a California martial arts newsletter. This account is the most vivid of the three and also the one I trust least, because vivid memories written 15 years after the fact have a way of improving themselves into legend. What all three accounts agree on, the demonstration that followed lasted less than 2 minutes. It did not involve a full fight. It was something more controlled than that, and in some ways more disturbing. Lee asked Volkov to hold his arm out, elbow slightly bent, fist closed. He then placed his own fist against Volkov's chest, touching, essentially, no distance, and asked Lashkov to ask Volkov if he was ready. Volkov said yes. Sedov wrote that Volkov glanced back at him with an expression that was, quote, half amused. What happened next is the 1-inch punch, a technique Lee had been developing and refining since the early 1960s. A method of generating explosive force from the hip and shoulder through a strike with almost no windup. A technique that violates the intuitive physics most people apply to hitting things, where power requires distance, wind-up, visible preparation. Volkov moved backward. He did not fall. He was not knocked unconscious. But he moved backward in a way that, according to all three accounts, he did not expect and could not immediately explain. Sedov wrote that the Soviet champion stood very still for a moment afterward, then pressed his own hand against his chest where Lee had struck, as if checking whether something was there. The hall, all 400 people in it, was silent again. Then Volkov said something in Russian to Lashkov. Lashkov translated. He said, "How much of your body are you using when you do that?" Lee said, "All of it." What followed that exchange is, in retrospect, the more interesting part of the evening, though it does not make for the kind of story that gets told at the front of a documentary. Volkov asked to stay. The scheduled program had effectively ended. The organizers made a decision, quickly, to extend the evening. For the next hour and a half, in front of those 400 witnesses, Volkov and Lee talked, through Lashkov, occasionally in broken English, when Volkov's limited vocabulary was sufficient, about what power actually meant in a fighting context, what it came from, whether the distinction between Eastern and Western approaches was a real distinction or a difference in vocabulary describing the same underlying physics. Lee demonstrated. Volkov watched. Occasionally, Volkov moved, showed something from his own training, and Lee watched with an attention that Ku describes as like he was reading. Sedov wrote, "I had come expecting a curiosity, a representative of an exotic tradition. What I found instead was a physicist who had chosen the body as his laboratory." That line may be the most quoted thing ever written about that evening. It appears in 3 different books about Lee published between 1975 and 1991. It has been repeated so many times that most people who know it have no idea where it came from. What is less often quoted is what Sedov wrote in the paragraph that followed it. He wrote, "I should say that Volkov was not diminished by the evening. He was, by the end of it, genuinely interested. In a way I have rarely seen him show genuine interest in anything. He is not a man who admits being wrong easily. What he did that night was something different. He adjusted. He added information. That is not the same thing as being wrong. I am not sure he would agree with that distinction, but I think it matters. That paragraph changes the story, not the facts of it, the meaning. The question that had been sitting in the room since Volkov spoke at the microphone, the question that Lee had stood up to answer, was not really about power, not about physics, not about whose tradition produced harder punches. It was the question that followed Bruce Lee everywhere in those years. Through every demonstration, every encounter with skeptics, every room full of people who looked at 5 feet 7 inches and 135 pounds and made a calculation that felt obvious to them. The question was, does this count? Whether what he had built, the body, the system, the philosophy he had been assembling since he was 13 years old, whether it registered as real in a world that measured realness in ways he did not fit, whether a man his size, from a tradition that most Western-trained fighters dismissed as ceremonial, could occupy the same space as someone like Volkov without it being somehow charitable, a courtesy extended, a nice story to tell. Lee had been living inside that question for a decade. He understood it completely. He had no particular anger about it, or if he did, the anger had long since been converted into something more useful. What he had instead was an answer that did not require explanation. That did not ask for belief in advance. That could be felt. Here is what I found when I tried to verify the details of that evening. The Dynamo Sports Complex in Hong Kong existed. It hosted events through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. I found no record of this specific event in any archive I was able to access. That is not surprising. Minor cultural exchange demonstrations were not the kind of thing that generated formal documentation, and Soviet athletic programs from that era were notably opaque about their activities in Southeast Asia. Sedov's dispatch exists in one form, a reproduction in a 1979 Hong Kong martial arts magazine that claims to have translated it from the original Russian. I cannot confirm the original dispatch exists. I cannot confirm Sedov existed in the form he has been described, though there are Soviet sports journalists from that period with similar names. The gaps here are real, and I am not going to pretend they are not. What I can tell you is that Thomas Koo is a real person, and his 1997 interview is documented, and he describes the evening with a consistency across multiple retellings that I find convincing in the specific way that honest memories are convincing. They include the small things that invented memories leave out. The borrowed car, the dark jacket, the exact pace of the walk. Whether the evening happened exactly this way, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is that it describes something that happened many times, in various forms, in Bruce Lee's actual life, and that the specific question at the center of it, the question about what counted as real, was one he engaged with his whole career. Near the end of that evening, as the crowd was finally beginning to disperse, Volkov approached Lee one more time. He had a question he had apparently been forming for a while. He delivered it in Russian, Lashkov translated, and the question was this: "What do you call your system? What is the name of what you do?" Lee thought for a moment. "I don't have a name for it," he said. "A name would put walls around it." Volkov considered this. Then he said, in the limited English he had, "In Russia we say, the cup must be empty to receive water." Lee looked at him. "Yes," he said, "but the cup also has to be strong enough to hold what you pour in." Volkov laughed. It was the first time, according to Koo, that either of them had laughed that evening. It broke something open that had been quietly tightening since the moment Lee stood up from his seat. They talked for another 20 minutes after that. Lashkov translating steadily, the hall emptying around them, Sedov watching from a distance, writing notes on a small pad he kept in his left breast pocket. Koo says he stayed until the lights in the hall were turned off. He says that when Lee finally walked out to the parking lot to find the borrowed car, he seemed neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, not like a man who had proven something, more like a man who had had an interesting conversation that he would be thinking about for a while. I asked him what he thought of the Russian, Koo said in his 1997 interview. He said, "He's honest. That's rarer than being right." The photograph, the one supposedly taken that evening, showing Volkov at the microphone, smiling before anything had happened, is described by the people who claim to have seen it as being black and white, printed on a slightly glossy paper, slightly overexposed on the left side. One of them says you can see, at the far right edge of the frame, a partial image of someone in the fourth row. Dark jacket, white shirt, not looking at the camera, looking at Volkov. Whether that is Lee, I cannot tell you. Whether the photograph exists at all, I cannot tell you. Whether this specific evening transpired in exactly the way I have described it, with these words, this sequence, this light, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is that the question Volkov asked into that microphone, and the walk Lee made to answer it, and the silence that fell over 400 people in a rented hall on a Tuesday evening in March, that is not a story that was invented. It is a story that was remembered by people who were there, and people who heard it from people who were there, and people who recognized in it something that was already true before they heard it for the first time. There are stories like that. They accumulate weight not because they are confirmed, but because they keep being told. And they keep being told because something in them stays accurate about something that actually happened. This is one of those stories, even the parts I cannot prove.